Hi everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm Mr. VaughnHuffer and this video is a free response question explained for Unit 1. So the question we're going to be covering today can be found in AP Classroom under Unit 1 FRQ, and the question I picked to explain to you is question number 5. The question says, describe how the properties of water contribute to two of the following. We have to describe how water contributes to two of the following below. So you see first we have transpiration, next we have thermoregulation, and then the third option is plasma membrane structure. So first we're going to talk about the properties of water. I've included some information here on a slide for you. So first of all, water is incredibly polar because it has that oxygen molecule and the two attached hydrogen molecules. And because oxygen is so electronegative, it hogs all of the electrons and therefore becomes partially negative. And this forces the hydrogens who have an electron deficiency to become partially positive. And so basically this turns water molecules into pretty much a little molecular magnet. So because of this high polarity, this causes water to have a very high specific heat. So specific heat is the amount of energy an object can absorb or release before it actually changes temperature by 1 degree Celsius. And you can see from the table with several substances listed and their specific heats, water has an incredibly high specific heat. So this means that water can absorb a lot of heat energy, light energy, or just energy in general before it actually changes temperature by 1 degree Celsius. On the flip side, you see lead down here has a very low specific heat capacity. And so lead, not only does it change temperature very quickly whenever it absorbs energy, it also releases that energy very quickly, so it cools down really quick. So this explains why water takes so long to boil and also takes a long time to cool off. So next we have cohesion. So again, this is a property that arises from water's high polarity. And because, like I said earlier, they act like little molecular magnets, basically cohesion is the sticking together of like polar molecules. Or in this case, the sticking together of water molecules to one another like a bunch of little magnets. And then next we have adhesion. So adhesion is the sticking together of unlike polar molecules. So two different kinds of molecules. An example of this is like water sticking to plastic. And so you see in the picture here, we have these two water molecules. They are cohesing together here in the middle where they're holding hands and they're sticking to one another, but they're also adhering to the walls of this container that they're in. So if you remember from our laboratory sections and how to measure liquids in a graduated cylinder, there's that little dip on the top of the fluid. That's called the bevel. And so if I can draw it on here for you, we have our graduated cylinder. All right, and then the water, when you fill it up, makes this little bevel shape. And so you're supposed to measure from the bottom of that bevel. So these sides here that are sticking up, all right, that is because of the adhesion of the water molecules to the glass graduated cylinder. So, and last, and this is not necessarily a property of water, but a property of molecules in general, that molecules only interact with other polar or other charged molecules. All right, so in general, like dissolves like. So a non-polar molecule, for instance, these little globules of oil here in this beaker, are non-polar and therefore they cannot interact with the water that is inside this container. So next we're going to talk about transpiration. So transpiration is the movement of water through a plant from the roots to the leaves. And it doesn't just move, it's not necessarily pumped. What happens is that the water evaporates from the leaves. So water evaporates from the leaves. And because of this, it actually pulls water up from the roots. So this is because of not only cohesion, but adhesion. So the water molecules sticking to one another, as you can see right here. All right, but they're also adhering to the walls of this xylem vessel. So xylem are the structures in plants that actually carry water. So I always remember xylem from phloem, that xylem carries water, WXY are WXY, so water xylem. And so basically, as the water evaporates from the leaves, it creates a negative pressure in the leaves. So this is like when you drink from a straw, right? And you put the straw in your mouth, you drop your tongue, and it creates a negative pressure inside your mouth that also creates a negative pressure at the top of the straw. And that negative pressure pulls your drink up from the bottom of the cup and into your mouth. So these xylem vessels in plants perform transpiration in the same way. So as you can see in the picture here, so this water evaporates here out of the leaf, and because of the negative pressure, the water is pulled up through the roots and into the leaves. So not only does this transport water through the plant, but the roots also absorb nutrients. And so these xylem vessels and this transpiration not only helps cool the plant through evaporative cooling, circulate water through the plant, but it also circulates nutrients that the plant needs for growth. So the importance of transpiration, again, it draws water and nutrients from the soil to the leaves. So this is because of the cohesion between water molecules and also the adhesion of the water molecules to the xylem walls. And this provides a means of evaporative cooling for plants. So since plants don't sweat and they can't run away and find shade, all right, as water absorbs surrounding energy, right, it takes that energy away from it when it evaporates. Basically, when we say energy, a lot of times we're talking about heat. So heat is one type of energy. Sunlight that is absorbed by plants is a lot of times converted from visible light, absorbed and then radiated back out as infrared light, or what we call heat. So next we're going to talk about thermoregulation. So thermoregulation is the process of controlling or maintaining an internal core temperature. And there are two different primary types of thermoregulation in the animal world. We have endothermic thermoregulation. These are warm-blooded animals, so endo meaning inside. All right, and so they can manage their body temperature from within. Animals that are endothermic can create their own heat through metabolism. So basically through breaking chemical bonds and releasing energy to generate heat. These animals maintain a consistent core temperature. For instance, humans, our core temperature is approximately 98.8. And generally speaking, endothermic animals require regular food to maintain their metabolism, because metabolism is a large way in how these organisms maintain their core temperature. And also, endothermic animals experience regular growth, so they grow throughout the year. On the flip side, we have exothermic organisms. Exothermic organisms oftentimes are called cold-blooded. However, this doesn't mean that their blood is actually cold. But these organisms regulate their body temperature using external factors. For instance, sun, water, um, wind. It's supposed to be a D right there. And evaporation or evaporative cooling. So their metabolism is largely dependent on the temperature. So if the temperature is cold, their metabolism is slow, and if the temperature is hot, their metabolism is high. Because their metabolism is dependent on the environment to some degree, and because they do not use metabolism to generate heat in the same way that endotherms do, exotherms generally have lower energy requirements as compared to endothermic organisms. Also, exothermic organisms they experience seasonal growth. So whenever it's colder, they don't grow as much because metabolism is lower. And whenever it's warmer, they grow more because metabolism is higher. How does water play a role in thermoregulation in endothermic animals? So you see on the left, we have a diagram of metabolic rate and thermoregulation. So this is an example of a negative feedback loop. As the core temperature changes, the body acts and responds to counteract that change, or basically to go the opposite direction from what we're currently going. So you see over here, I again have listed the specific heat capacity of water, 4.184. So again, how much energy water has to absorb before it actually changes temperature by 1 degree Celsius. So water has the highest specific heat of most common substances. So there's really nothing that can replace the function of water in terms of thermoregulation. Again, it can also absorb lots of energy, so light and heat before changing temperatures. And approximately 80% of animal blood is composed of water. So whenever your core temperature changes, all right, your thermostat inside of your body is the hypothalamus located in the brain. So whenever, say you're outside in summertime and you're getting a lot of sun, you're moving around, so your body starts heating up. The hypothalamus, all right, senses that your core temperature is rising, and then it causes the skin blood vessels to dilate. So dilate means to expand, so this allows more blood to flow through the blood vessels that are in your skin. So basically these are blood vessels that can exchange heat with the external environment. Also, your body triggers the activation of sweat glands. So more blood flow to the skin combined with evaporative cooling provided by sweat means that your blood is cooled as you're sweating and the sweat is evaporating off of your skin. And so this overall effect is to drop your body temperature and return you back to homeostasis. So the opposite side of this is cooling. So say you're in a blizzard, which sounds terrible, and your body's like, hey, it's really cold out here. I can sense my core temperature is starting to drop. Again, all right, hypothalamus, the thermostat of the body, recognizes that core temperature has dropped and activates a response. So the first thing is that your skin blood vessels begin to constrict, right? And so this way, in limiting the amount of blood flow to your skin, you can reduce the amount of heat that is lost from your blood into the external environment. So then your body also triggers your skeletal muscles, all of the muscles that move your bones, to start shivering. So this is not movement that serves any purpose other than to use and hydrolyze ATP and generate heat. So this is plus heat here. And so the combination of heat generation and reduced heat loss because of reduced blood flow to the skin means that your body then generates more heat and better holds on to heat, and therefore your core temperature jumps back up to normal and maintains homeostasis. The last part that we're going to talk about is the plasma membrane and its interactions with water. As you guys should already know, that the plasma membrane mostly consists of these phospholipids, or of a phospholipid bilayer. So you see layer 1, layer 2, they make a nice little sandwich here. All right, there are also some membrane proteins in the plasma membrane, right? These are added later. And as you can see, there are some carbohydrates, so maybe these are signal recognition molecules, and a lot of times also some cholesterol. And so the cholesterol acts to increase membrane fluidity and prevents these phospholipids from packing so tightly that they make a rigid structure. So an interesting thing is that whenever you put phospholipids into water, they aggregate and form a structure known as a micelle. And this is shown below. Basically, like, this is a little fat ball in the water, kind of like a lipid droplet. All right, and the reason it does this is because phospholipids have these hydrophobic tails, so hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fearing. So these hydrophobic tails do not want to interact with water, and they'll do anything they can to avoid it at all cost. On the other end of the molecule, you have this hydrophilic head group, or a phosphate group, all right, shown over here, that is a highly polar molecule and is hydrophilic. So this means that it loves water. It is willing and ready to interact with water. And so when you put all these phospholipids in water, all right, to reduce the unwanted interactions between hydrophobic and hydrophilic parts, all right, all of these hydrophobic tails bury themselves inside and make a hydrophobic core, and all of the hydrophilic heads, all right, flip to the outside so that they can interact with water. And so as you modify these phospholipids and say add an extra tail, like you can see here, all right, you go from a micelle to a lipid bilayer. And the interesting thing is, if you have this lipid bilayer sandwich here, right, you got your little tails hanging down there. All right, you still have these ends over here that are exposed to water, and the tails do not want to interact with water, and therefore this whole structure then forms a circular shape like this, so that the hydrophobic tails are completely isolated away from the water. You get this little phospholipid bilayer donut shape, aka a cell. Because water is so polar, it brings about all of these other properties, or all of these other types of interactions. So cohesion, adhesion, a high specific heat. And since it can only interact with other polar molecules, for instance, phosphate groups or ionic solids, carbohydrates, amino acids, and nucleic acids, all right, water cannot interact with these hydrophobic non-polar lipids. All right, so now to answer the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and answer all three parts. So the first part, describe how the properties of water contribute to transpiration. So again, I've included the diagram here to the left. So I've also included some vocabulary to use in your answer. So adhesion, again, is when water molecules stick to the sides of the xylem tubes in plants. For this question, cohesion comes into play when the water molecules stick to one another, also inside of the xylem. And then we need to mention evaporation. So this is what pulls the water from the leaves and creates that negative pressure, so kind of like a straw. We also need to use the word absorption and talk about how roots absorb water from the soil, because that's an important part of transpiration. And we also need to mention the xylem, or the small tubes in plants, basically the little plant straws that carry water and nutrients from the roots to the leaves. This not only identifies that you know what transpiration does, all right, but then it also includes properties of water. So adhesion, cohesion, all right, and it talks about how they stick. And we also use evaporate because that's what creates the negative pressure. So for the second part, describe how the properties of water contribute to thermoregulation in endotherms. Vocabulary to use: specific heat, also known as the amount of energy loss or gain required to change temperature. We have hydrogen bonding, so those electrostatic temporary bonds formed between partially negative and partially positive charges. We also need to mention the hypothalamus because that's what regulates temperature response in endotherms. And we need to mention evaporative cooling because that's one of the biggest effects that the properties of water have on thermoregulation in endotherms. We have identified what an endotherm is. We have said property of water: specific heat makes them more resistant. And also we mentioned hypothalamus, the control center or the thermostat. We mentioned skeletal muscles and shivering to generate heat and talk about how it is absorbed and held onto by the water. So this goes directly back to heat. And then we also talked about when temperature rises, blood vessels in our skin dilate and allow more blood to flow. And then the production of sweat and evaporative cooling, also associated with high specific heat, and then talk about how that lowers body temperature. So we've covered all the parts of regulation of homeostasis in endotherms, or thermoregulation in endotherms. So the last part, describe how the properties of water contribute to plasma membrane structure. Vocabulary to include: hydrophilic, of course, because we're talking about a lipid bilayer; hydrophobic, water loving, water hating; the phospholipid bilayer, which is the major component of plasma membranes, so the polar phosphate head and nonpolar lipid tails. And then also mention polarity. In this question, we have identified plasma membranes and what they are, how they're made. All right, we've identified the parts. So hydrophilic phosphate head, hydrophobic lipid tail. We've mentioned polar nature, which is a property of water, and talked about how it can't interact with the lipid tails, but it can interact with the phosphate heads. We've also mentioned that cells exist in aqueous or water-based environments. And then we continue, forces the tails together in a hydrophobic core, and talked about the phosphate head groups. So not only have we talked about the structure of the plasma membrane, but we have identified how the properties of water affect the overall structure of the plasma membrane. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Thanks for tuning in. Keep checking back for more videos. I hope this was helpful and have a great day. Bye.